Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. Okay, on this episode, I am very happy to bring my conversation I had with Sheena Mason. Sheena is an assistant professor of English at SUNY. She has a PhD with distinction in English from Howard University and specializes in Africana and American literature studies and philosophy of race. She has been published in many outlets, and she is the innovator of the Togetherness Wayfinder. She is the author of the latest book entitled The Raceless Antiracist: Why Ending Race is the Future of Antiracism. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. I wanted to get Sheena on. I followed her work for quite some time, actually, online and elsewhere. And I really like her approach of trying to understand race from sort of a different angle, different perspective, and really does a lot of good analysis, really, really great study on how to look at certain things historically, things in the moment, and try to, in a sense, get past, race in a way of saying, like, how do we look at folks? How do we see them for who they are? That we, yes, can celebrate and acknowledge their culture and their history and many things that, make us who we are, but that we don't overextend too much on these ideas that we have about race. And so it's been really, really nice to, part of the reason for having the podcast is to have people of different opinions on here. So I've had different conversations from different perspectives on race. And so after a while, you start to find folks that kind of have kind of the same kinds of ideas and say the same kinds of things. And so I've really tried to find really solid folks that do really excellent research that are looking at the things we're all talking about, but from different perspectives. And so Sheena is just absolutely lovely, brilliant. And so this was a main motivator. And I was very, very happy for her coming on and talking with me. We talk about, why do we have this obsession about race? Why are people talking about it? Obviously, things will happen in the news and things in our culture and events, but why do we have such this obsession about race? We talk about racelessness and the Wayfinder, and it's one of her projects. We define racism. She has a particular way of defining that. We talk about the history of the categories of race. We, of course, talk about culture, history, ethnicity. We have a nice bit on there about mixed race and mixed ethnicity. We talk about antiracism and practical ways to end racism and many other topics. Again, Sheena is just wonderful. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I really appreciate her work and her enthusiasm and her spirit. She's a really, really great person, and highly recommend reading her book. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So if you like this conversation, there's many other conversations on this topic in the back catalog. I highly recommend all of them. And tell your friends if you like it. Share widely. I really appreciate that. And now I bring you Sheena Mason. I am here with Sheena Mason. Sheena, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm greatly looking forward to speaking with you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a pleasure. I've been following a little bit of your work for some time. I know you've been working on a book, which is just out, and so we're going to get all into it. I guess before we do, tell listeners who you are. I guess professionally or academically, or any relevant details, and what you currently spend your time doing.
I'm an assistant professor in English at SUNY Oneonta in upstate New York, and all of my courses are cross-listed with Africana and Latinx studies. I'm also the founder of an educational firm called Togetherness Wayfinder, the subject of today's conversation. And so outside of classrooms, I spend my time teaching other people who are not undergraduate students about race, racism, anti-racism, and all the things. Oh, also outside of work, because I am a whole human being, I have a wife. We just celebrated our 6th wedding anniversary on Friday.
Congrats.
Thank you. And we have 5-year-old triplets who just started kindergarten last week. So, and we have 2 dogs because that's not enough responsibilities and obligations. So.
That is a full house. That is a full house. My goodness.
Yes. And all of the energy is keeping me young. That's what I tell myself.
It will keep you young for a little bit. I am definitely grateful that you're giving me your time today to talk, because that is I'm sure your schedules look insane. So that's great though. That is a full life. So that's very, very nice. So obviously, the book, I should mention the book here, is The Raceless Antiracist: Why Ending Race is the Future of Antiracism. As quite the title. It's a good title, but it's quite the title. So we're going to talk about race. So nobody's ever talked about this ever before. So we'll be the first to talk about race and race issues. I joke, but this is a topic that is something that people, oh man, I mean, I'd say for the past 10, 15 years have talked about. Definitely in 2020 and subsequent years, people have, some folks have been obsessive in how they've talked about it. So I guess the first question I have for you is why are we as I'll say as Americans, but we can definitely broaden this out internationally too, I think, of sorts, but we'll mostly stick to the U.S. Why are people so interested in this topic? What is it about race that kind of really animates people? Why are we so invested in understanding, race issues, I guess?
Well, I know from my perspective, I'm obsessed with it and have been for about 20 years, since I was an undergraduate student myself, primarily because of how racism affects me and how it affects other people. I'm a person who has experienced a lot of violence and trauma in her life, and something about those experiences as a child and growing up led me to see myself in the literature I study, which is primarily African American literature, and to see myself in what people would call the struggle to advance human rights, and to commit my life's purpose and my life's work to advancing that cause. So I know from my perspective, my obsession comes from that place, right? I feel like people shouldn't have to be dehumanized, devalued, taught and told and programmed to think that they don't belong. And the result of that, to me, it's a question of morality. It's a question of ethics. And my morals and my ethics lead me to feel passionately enough about this that I write about it. I go on podcasts like yours and talk about it incessantly and, yes, obsessively. And I teach my students about it because I want to change it. And yeah, you say maybe the last 10 years or so, there's been an increase in terms of discussion and focus. But the folks that I study, the history that I study, these conversations have always been happening since, the United States became the United States. It's just a question of the context in which a person lives and the kinds of experiences and history that a person is introduced to, which will dictate whether or not this is a conversation they consistently have or consistently hear, what circles they're in, and whether or not they feel strongly enough to join the conversation.
I guess one challenge that can happen sometimes is people will essentialize race, where they see it in everything, right? Where it's literally, you can go to work, you can have friends, you can, have colleagues, it doesn't matter really in any aspect of life. They will see race as the first or the primary or the central component of who they are, how they identify, all these things. Do you feel that there's well, I guess that happens, that people kind of essentialize race? Is that just a kind of worldview framework, or is there some dangers if people do that in a certain way? What do you think about kind of looking at things that way?
Race is essentializing, and that's why people like myself obsess over it. The very category of race, the impetus for it, the invention of it, the illusion of it, the practice of assigning race to the human species from the outset was such that the entire premise of the category was meant to dehumanize certain people, namely people who were enslaved. And those people were largely people of African descent in the United States. That economic and social system and that hierarchy was on the ground, and the supposed justification of that comes through the invention and the illusion of race. So the fact that people see it everywhere, the fact that people often talk about it as like race essentializes, etc. Well, that's accurate and true. It is everywhere because we're taught to believe in race. We're taught to assign race to the human species wrongly and incorrectly so. We're taught to conflate race with things that actually have benefit to people, like culture, right? Ethnicity, social class, economic class, the causes and effects of racism itself. Our media confirms that illusion of race and the practice of assigning race to human beings. So it confirms the dehumanizing, essentializing apparatus. Our government does this to us, right? Like every medical place you go to, you have to check the box. Every school you go to, our education system, which is arguably part of the government, you have to check the box. So every facet, our religious institutions teach us to think in these racialized and often racist perspectives. So in virtually every facet and aspect of American life, you are confronted with the reality of racism. And you're confronted with the reality of those other things that I called to earlier, the other social constructions, culture, ethnicity, etc., that are described in race language, right? And often confused with race. So, of course, it seems like people are obsessing over this topic and of course, it seems to many people that it is everywhere. And of course, it seems to other people that those people are essentializing because that's the very design of the thing itself, right? Like how it actually works in our society is supposed to keep us in antagonistic relationships with each other. And it's supposed to keep some people hyper-focused on the problem of racism, but talking in the language of race. And it's supposed to keep other people hyper-focused on usually ignoring, erasing, or undervaluing or underappreciating or mistranslating what people mean by race in the first place. And so we stay going around the mulberry bush. And part of my hope is in giving people an alternative framework and challenging what virtually everyone says about this one topic. As you said, the topic that no one talks about, right? We're being cheeky here. What I'm saying is y'all all have it wrong, right? And here's why. Here's the evidence, right? And here's what we need to do moving forward in order to help more people get it right so that we can actually solve the problems that are underpinning what some people are pointing to, but often unintentionally maintaining.
So I guess the one thing I'm curious about here is, well, let's define a few terms of sorts, but your kind of main thesis of the book is why race is inadequate for a way of kind of a framework to describe folks, and you're pushing for racelessness is what it sounds like, right? And so we can talk about later about where color blindness kind of fits in here. I know you mentioned that in the book, and there's other people that have had different opinions about that too, of course. But for yourself, I guess, where do you find how we can have a kind of operationalized definition of race? In terms of people's color, blackness, whiteness, things like that. How do you define it, and then why do you feel race or the concept is inadequate and not a helpful framework or structure for us?
So I want to correct what my core argument actually is, right? And I'm going to read directly from the book to start to get some excerpts out here in the world.
That's good.
So in the preface, I write that the core argument behind the Togetherness Wayfinder, formerly the theory of racelessness, is that the undoing of racism requires the undoing of the belief in human races and the practice of racialization to undo various social and economic power imbalances. And I write, put another way, only by ceasing to maintain so-called race ideology, which includes articulations of colorblindness and more explicitly race-centered discourse, and its corresponding language, can we stop how society upholds racism, sometimes unintentionally. So I feel it's important to read that because the common interpretation is, as you articulated there, that I'm advocating for us to stop using race language or us to stop talking about race, or that race is quote unquote inadequate in terms of talking and thinking about human beings, right? And in some sense, there's some truth underlying there, but I feel like people often mistakenly imagine that I'm saying we should skip to the good part, and they're also missing the fact that in my thinking of racism and in my definition of it, am pointing to the power imbalances and the hierarchies that are often very difficult for folks to confront and recognize, much less want to do anything about. I came to my thinking and I came to the creation of the Togetherness Wayfinder, which is a framework that includes language, philosophy, certain information, different concepts that in whole can help us get to the bottom of what racism is in a more effective way, thereby helping us stop the causes and effects. And my first articulation of the Wayfinder was something along the lines of, to undo racism, we have to undo race. And there's a process that's involved in that, which is what the Wayfinder offers folks, the process. Now, as I define racism, this is also very important because oftentimes when people have discussions about racism, there isn't a clear understanding and agreement in terms of how one is actually defining racism. And one aspect of the Wayfinder that takes a lot of, I think, intentional and strategic, emotional and intellectual practice is that when you hear me, Sheena Mason, talking about racism and using the word racism, I mean it in the way that I define it, right? As tends to be the case when most people use words, they mean it in the way that they define it. Yeah. So that emphasis becomes really critical because some people wrongly define racism in a variety of other ways. And part of my contention is because we're not defining racism aptly and precisely, that's part of the problem, right? Like it, in a lot of ways, how most people define racism helps to maintain the actual machinery of racism. So I define racism, and I think it's also important to note that I spell the word racism with the word race in it, right? So just imagine the word race and then followed by ism. I define it as a socially constructed system of economic and social oppression that requires the belief in human races and the practice of racialization to reinforce those various power imbalances. So earlier when I was talking briefly about the tenuous history of, related to the invention of the category of race, when you look at the word race and the practice of racialization in early modern European society, for example, you see that there's a sort of hierarchy that's being reflected in their thinking of race and their use of what was then race language, but that often had to do with like family, bloodline, less to do with how we think of like race today, black and white, Asian, mixed, etc., right? Because you're talking about primarily all English people. They had a way of reflecting and maintaining the economic and social hierarchies that existed in England at that time. And part of how they do that, right, is through indeed essentializing through the category of race and by other means, the bloodlines, the supposed essence of different people. You get that concept of race and the practice of reflecting and reinforcing desired hierarchies taken over to what would become the United States. And then you see the introduction of language that already existed in English, namely white and black, for instance, where everything negative is associated with everything darkness, black, right? And everything positive is associated with white, purity, innocence, piety, all of the positive things get associated with white. And then you take that and you apply that type of language to human beings. And the express purpose of the early modern Europeans doing that primarily the elites and primarily Anglo-Saxons, the English, was because they wanted to maintain the elites, they being the elites, wanted to maintain their economic and social power over virtually everyone else. And that required the exploitation of Africans and then African Americans within the system of chattel slavery that required the exploitation of working class and poor people of more European descent who got racialized as white. How do you do that? You put them in antagonistic relationships with each other by inventing and then reinforcing at every turn race ideology, which, when best understood, really is translating that into racist ideology, right? And then you put it in the education system, you put it in the media, you put it in theater, you put it in music, you put it in the government, so that at every turn, every generation inherits that way of seeing themselves and seeing the world. And then it becomes such that it is a naturalized category now. Now it's seemingly intractable because, people look at me all the time and ask, how do you think it's actually possible to create a world without racism, right? But at the time of chattel slavery, plenty of people thought it was impossible to actually create another world without chattel slavery. So that's just some of the history that I present in the book, right? The history of the category itself, thereby the history of racism in the context of American society. And I demonstrate how that practice of assigning the human species, the singular human species, the category of race, reflects the problem of racism and reinforces the causes and effects of it. And that's the binding that we're in right now. That's the entanglement that we're in. It's doing all of the things at once, and it's a sort of self-reinforcing machine. And the primary way that we're going to uproot it is to, number one, recognize what racism is as I define it. Stop reinforcing the category of race, which most definitions of racism include the language of race in an unproblematized way, and use better language to talk about racism. Instead of saying I'm a black person or a white person, I'm a person who gets racialized as black, or that person is a person who gets racialized as white, so that we center the human first, something that the category of race is not meant to do. And we show that there's external factors that actually cause the person to be racialized in a particular way. And now we're starting to get somewhere, right? And I cannot say enough that I'm not advocating for us to skip to the good part, because we tried that. The colorblindness thing, we've tried that. And it failed. It failed largely because it ignores the problem of racism. And so long as we ignore racism while keeping the components of it, namely the belief in race and the practice of assigning race, then we will continue to reap what we sow, which is racism. So we can't do that, right?
So that's very good. I mean, the history there is important, I think, for sure. I'm not going to disagree with any of that. I guess you don't like how race is in a lot of these things, or how we like you said, it's in all of society, because is it that you don't like the term, so the heuristic of like, okay, this is a race of people, right? And then we categorize, black, white, Latin, whatever you want to say as race. Is it that you don't like the term, or you don't like how the term is in everything? Because, I mean, we'll talk about a little bit of population genetics in a bit, I'm sure, but, I can obviously look at Brad Pitt and Idris Elba and say these two guys are not the same race, right? If I'm looking on that category, right? Obviously they're two dudes, they're two human beings. Great, we get that. But I can obviously see that like they're of a different quote unquote race, right? These are just people I'm pulling out of the air. How do you, I guess, wrestle with the framework that we are living in, right, where we do see kind of these things of race, and say, is it the fact of like, no, I don't like those terms, or I don't like how we're using them, or here's an alternative that's better? What is the kind of space there? Because I feel like if you were to tell a lot of people, they'd be like, well, obviously it's real. I see it all the time. Like I have a friend that he's black, or a friend that's Asian, or a friend, whatever. These categories. I guess I'm pinning you down here. What is it you don't like, I guess, specifically about the idea of race?
Well, one thing I don't like is that we're talking about it in terms of me liking and not liking a thing, right? Because that's irrelevant, right? It's the evidence in my analysis and logic and reasoning that has led me to my conclusions.
Yeah.
And but if there's something I don't like, which has called me to question and interrogate the category of race itself and how we employ it, it's that racism is hiding its face behind that very thing. So in upholding the problem of racism by speaking about race and human beings in that way, that's the problem, right? And for me, as I said earlier, it's a moral and ethical problem. Rather than say, well, obviously Brad Pitt is white and obviously Idris Elba is black, which he might have something to say about that, because he has spoken about that.
Yeah, he has. Yeah.
No, that's to American minds. Those are the obvious race categories, right? But race is not biological. Skin color is, but race is not skin color, right? And so long as we trick ourselves into thinking that race is skin color and that race is biological, even though modern science for at least 100 years, like we've known for a very, very, very long time that race is not biological, and you still see the persistence of what's called scientific racism, right? People who actually profit off of us continuing to uphold and maintain the status quo. Race isn't biological, and race is also not a social construction. The social construction is racism itself. So, to my mind, the problem is racism, and racism is a morally corrupt and bankrupt way of creating hierarchies that are morally wrong and shouldn't exist and don't need to happen. So to me, it's foolishness to say, well, number one, that it's everywhere, so therefore we should either ignore it or just keep it or reconstruct it. To me, that's foolishness, because I want a better future for my children. So, I'll just say that. I want a better future for my students who some of them suffer, right? Because they feel like they don't belong in the world anywhere they go, and that's wrong. And just because something doesn't impact you or doesn't impact me doesn't mean it shouldn't be something that I care about. Like, I'm a compassionate human being, and I think the world would be a better place if more people were compassionate human beings, right? So for all of those reasons, I would say there's motivation and reason for us to be more truthful and to better reflect our actual reality than to uphold what is essentially like a unicorn. Unicorns are not real. And just because my daughter thinks that unicorns are real, and a lot of little young children in the world think that unicorns are real, doesn't make unicorns real, right? It's not real. Now, listen, if a unicorn magically appears at some point in time, don't quote me on this, but I'm just gonna say with confidence, like that's not a real thing, right? And so at some point, my daughter has to learn the truth about reality, right? And just being a proponent too for like truth and accuracy, putting aside the moral question, it's like, to me, do you want to take the red pill or the blue pill, right? If we're in the matrix, which one do you want to take? And to me, the question is, or the answer is always going to be whichever one is going to give me the truth. And race doesn't give us the truth, and how we're talking about it maintains the fiction, it maintains the falsehood, and it maintains the problems, that the material impact that come along with it. And all of that together for me is the problem. Because it doesn't have to be that way. That's how it is, but it doesn't have to be that way. And then the last thing I'll say is, like, yeah, some of what I'm advocating for is a shift in how we describe the problem of racism, not just with the definition, but also like, well, in honor of what you said about like recognizing the reality of what people believe, right? It's the reality of what people believe. It's not actual reality, but it's what people believe, right? So it's a type of reality. Well, yeah, I say the same thing by saying that Brad Pitt is a person who gets racialized as white, right? Idris Elba in American society gets racialized as black, right? That shift alone, like I said earlier, it sounds simple. It's not rocket science. And I will be the first, listen, I came up with it, right? But I'll be the first to say it's not rocket science. And yet it actually ideologically shifts us from the racialized and racializing positions that, however we get racialized, put us in. And that shift alone can have a positive material impact, and reduce or eliminate some of the barriers that the category of race and the ways that we normally talk about it maintain and require. Because the category of race was never meant to unify and bring us together, right? Like that would defy the literal reality that existed back then. And so that shift alone can help us go a longer way. And then the last thing I'll say too is that one critical component of the Wayfinder is what I call racelessness translation. And that requires us to translate what we assume is race, like skin color, right? What we describe in race language, like skin color or hair texture or whatever, right? Primarily, I hear skin color a lot, but also I hear things like ancestry and DNA and stuff, right? To translate those things into what people are really talking about, which I think in American society, a more apt term for phenotype and heritage and all that would be ethnicity, without racializing it, or to translate it into something being communicated about culture, right? That people appreciate, that they value, or translating it into the problem of racism. There's no reason for me to reference Brad Pitt as a person who gets racialized as white, unless I'm talking about the problem of racism, right? There's no other reason for me to do that. So making those kinds of linguistic shifts the ideological positionality of folks in a way that is actually generative and actually helpful and accurate and true. And And right now, we're stuck in a quagmire of untruths from all sides because we're coming from it from our own racialized and racializing perspectives, which are false.
It brings up something that I'm thinking as you're saying this is so as I ask you these things, these are kind of sort of the questions I hear, or I have 7 voices in my head. So, well, what about all these things? But one thing I think that I've always been curious about, and reading your book, and I've heard others kind of sort of speak on this too. It's always an interesting kind of move a bit of how we incorporate this. So I'm really curious about your position on this. I think sometimes people are reticent to letting go of the kind of race kind of label, right? Because they know it or whatever. But sometimes I think the reticence is, well, what about my heritage, my culture, my history? We can throw in here ethnicity in some ways as well. Like people, I don't want to throw out that stuff. Like I like my culture's history and some of the things we have and how we do things. And if you're saying that these terms are not helpful, or we shouldn't use white, black, Latin, Asian, Native, whatever it is, well, does that mean I'm throwing out all of my history and culture and tradition and norms and family stories and all these things if all of a sudden I'm going beyond that? I think for in my mind, well, which is I think reasonable. I think people like those things. I think people might say, well, I don't want to get rid of that. I don't want to get that's like my history. That's my kinds of from my folks, like I don't want to get rid of that. And I think sometimes that's why people are reticent, but you have an interesting way, I think, of disentangling that. So help us try to navigate sort of like, yes, people can have a collective history or a culture and all these things, but not using the race kinds of heuristics maybe isn't needed of sorts. How do we kind of get rid of that, but keep still those types of things as well? What are your thoughts, analysis on that?
Well, first I would point out that I'm still using the terms when I'm talking about racism, right? That's important, right? I'm just not saying, I'm not doing the shorthand or the shortcut and saying an Asian person, right? A person who gets racialized as Asian. Yeah. So I think that's important, right? Because there are some people who would mishear me, I guess, and say, or think that I'm saying, like, just throw that language in the trash. No, like the words still exist. The words will exist probably for a long time, though maybe not forever and always. But in terms of how we describe the problem of racism, I'm saying we need to shift it so that we're not doing the shorthand, right? So that we can be clear. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, it seems like many people that I talk with about this topic who ask me kind of similar questions often frame it in a way that to me makes it seem as if the sort of avatar that most people have in minds, as you described, are like primarily people who get racialized as Black or of color, put that in quotation marks, right? Because if we know anything about the history and if we know anything about how it works now, we would recognize that the people primarily who embrace the so-called race categories are those people, right? Because at least 50% of people who get racialized as white in the United States have a hard time recognizing that they get racialized as white in the United States. That's the design of that particular category. And so in framing it that way, I think it's limiting, because on the one hand, I'm like, okay, I recognize what we're talking about here. And yes, this is something that we should talk about. And in my life and work, I tend to center people who get racialized as Black as well, because I get racialized as Black. That's what I study. I study all Africana studies and literature. It's what I teach. It's like a whole thing. So it's natural for me to center people who get racialized as Black in my thinking and in my talks. But I don't want to miss the fact that people who get racialized as white are also getting racialized, right? They're also part of this race ideology problem. I mean, people who racialize themselves as white in early modern society were people who literally invented the problem of racism, right? So let's not miss or lose sight of that. And it's important to acknowledge that because, again, the design of racism in this country makes it so that too many people who get racialized as white have, again, a very hard time like recognizing this, acknowledging it, and much less wanting to confront it. And it needs to be confronted. The category of white needs to be confronted because that category is what is supposed to make every other category inferior. That's why you have the BIPOC acronym, right? Everyone else gets lumped together and the category of white is supposedly superior. And that's how we move and act in the world, as if that category is superior. So it needs to be confronted, and arguably it needs to be abolished first, the category of whiteness. Part of what the Togetherness Wayfinder offers folks, especially those who get racialized as white, is a way to do that work more effectively than we've been able to do before, largely because when you use the language in the way that we're used to, like calling Brad Pitt a white person, I don't know why we've picked Brad Pitt, but calling him a white person, that very linguistic use of race there is actually a barrier to some people's understanding of what we're talking about here. And that's what causes us to constantly misdirect our discussions, to misdirect our efforts, because now we've got to convince white Brad Pitt that he's white, right? And that white means that he's seen as superior and treated as superior in this country, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes you cannot, it's a losing battle. You can't get white Brad Pitt to acknowledge his so-called whiteness, right? Because that's the design of it. But if we do the linguistic shift, it doesn't remove accountability from where it's due, which is primarily our government and various institutions, but it does enable more white Brad Pitts to grapple with the problem of racism. And that's a requirement if we actually want to solve the problem, right? So that's that. But then there are folks like myself who get racialized as Black or racialized of color, and who see that there's value and benefit behind the category of race and pride, right? Heritage, ancestry, history, DNA, and everything a person can love about oneself sometimes gets wrapped up in race and our thinking about race. And we know that too because it's evidenced through our description of culture in race language, like Black culture, Black American culture, right? Let me tell you, when I first got to the place where I am intellectually, this was during my PhD program. I went to Howard University, a historically Black university, and I passed with distinction, which is reserved for something like less than 3% of humanities PhDs worldwide a year. I don't know, some crazy statistic.
Yeah, it's a big deal. It's a big deal.
I mean, listen, it was the best moment of my life. I didn't even know passing with a distinction was a thing, but I did it. And then I had to Google it because I was like, I don't actually know what this means. So that happened. But when I was there, I went to my mentor's office many a times. And the first time I got to a place of saying, I figured out what my brain has been showing me since my studies started really in undergrad. To undo racism, we've got to undo race. And I cried about it, Xavier, because I didn't yet fully understand or appreciate what my brain was showing me. And my heart was telling me like something different, you know, because everything I love about myself, my tenacity, my resilience, my determination, my beauty, you name it, my intelligence. My wife thinks I'm like the funniest person in the universe. I'm compassionate, I'm empathetic. Everything I love about myself, I saw as my blackness, right? And I saw blackness as indeed racial, and I saw it as all these other things. It was a super expansive category for me. And I always remember my mentor at the time, she told me, you don't have to be the martyr and today just like stop calling yourself black, right? You just have to put your ideas into the world, like get published, you know, if you go on to teach after graduation, like teach your students, you can do all of that, but you don't have to like be a martyr. Let the future generations work that out. And I was like, okay, I guess that's satisfactory, but if I'm not one thing, I'm not a hypocrite. So I couldn't know what I knew, but then do the thing, you know, do the thing that I knew was not good for me or anyone else, right? Race is a thoroughly pernicious category. There's nothing positive or beneficial there. So fast forward a couple of years, I'm toward the end of my program, and something finally unlocked in my brain where I learned or realized that actually the reason my brain got me there is because I finally came to a place of recognizing race as indeed a thoroughly pernicious category that has no benefit to the vast majority of humans. And in letting go or critiquing, interrogating, desiring to abolish that category, all I was really working to abolish was the problem of racism, particularly anti-Black racism. And that's not the same thing as saying like, oh, I want to throw away my heritage, or I want to ignore the fact that I have melanin in my skin and curly hair, or I want to, I don't know, like people would say whitewash culture in some weird way or some self-hating way or something like that. No, I actually have a proliferated understanding of all of those things because I'm not looking at it through the prism of racism, AKA white supremacy in the context of American society. And because I'm not looking at it through that prism, I've actually freed myself from, I don't know, like any misconceptions or unrealities of how we think about culture, how a person thinks about themselves as individuals and collectives and so on, that I am so beyond grateful for having gone down the journey. And when I work with students who get racialized as Black, they inevitably experience the same type of liberation, a sort of intellectual, psychological, emotional liberation. They call it spiritual, emotional, and intellectual work, because they recognize that, number one, importantly, I'm recognizing and confronting racism full on. So I'm not right. Some people will just argue for maintaining the category because they want you to recognize that racism is a problem. So there's that, right? So I'm doing that, okay, checking the box, right? And I'm also recognizing whatever makes them different, right, from so-called white people, right? More melanin in the skin, all that, heritage, ancestors, all the things, right? And I'm giving them a freer conception of what so-called Black culture or Black American culture actually is. Because if you pay attention to the media or politicians, sometimes family members, you know, you never know who's advocating for these like inferior views of so-called Black culture. But if you learn about culture through the prism of racism, you often have racist ideas about what Black culture even is, right? Even if you have also positive ideas of what it is. And so in letting go of the BS, right, the stuff that's not true and not actually Black culture, that's a freeing thing. That's like a positive thing that people experience. So it's just a matter of strategy. It's a matter of giving alternative toolkits and insight and education and information, evidence to help more people properly translate what they're meaning to communicate themselves when they think they're talking about race, to be able to better communicate and translate what other people are saying when they talk about race, so that the bridge building can start. And people inevitably come to recognize, if they stay with me long enough, they inevitably come to recognize that the only thing I'm advocating for is the abolition of racism. And that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Not the abolition of anything else that is actually of value.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you sharing your experience. It's very, very helpful, actually. It gives a lot of kind of meat on the bones of sorts of some of these things, because I think that, yeah, it sounds like when I was listening to what you were saying, that you were kind of tied to all of this, the good stuff, all the things that you really liked, and was tied to this thing that you don't like, or you realized you didn't, namely race, this idea. And so if once you let it go, it was kind of like this freeing kind of thing of like, oh, I don't have to tether it to race. Now I can have these things sit on their own, and these things can still have even maybe more value for myself. I can still be proud of or accept or really enjoy all these things, and it doesn't need to be entangled with a very, pernicious and, messy concept like race. Was what it sounds like is what that experience was like for you a bit.
Yes, which my brain automatically translates. You're using the word race, which is part of my evidence that race and racism it's exactly the same thing. But you're using the word race, and my mind automatically translates it into racism, right? Like, I ultimately came to see myself outside of the confines of racism. And I don't know. I feel like most people operating in good faith would be very hard pressed to argue why I should see myself from within the confines of racism, right? Unless they are just blatant racists.
Right.
And like, there are people that like that do exist, that do argue with me on the internet, but for the most part,
you'll find always someone to argue with on the internet. That's easy.
For the most part, people, when they're able to sit with my ideas long enough, which is why reading the Raceless Antiracist is critical, because, I didn't just come up with this stuff overnight, and even our extended conversation is not going to be enough for people to really like grapple and sit with what I'm communicating here.
Yeah.
But the more people engage with anything I'm saying, the more of an epiphany, they come to for themselves, which is the important thing too, because, it doesn't matter how logical, how fact-based, how evidence-based a person comes. Because we're all living from our own perspectives and our own worldviews. Oftentimes we tend to hear people as saying things that we think they're saying, right? Whether that's good, bad, or indifferent. And I find that's especially true with this topic of race. We all are socialized to see through a particular prism and to view race in a particular way. So nobody to date has told me something that I haven't heard a million times, that I haven't studied and read a million times. And it's always interesting, fascinating to me how people interpret what I say based on their own beliefs. Sure, and sometimes that means they run in the door. They're like, oh, the Togetherness Wayfinder, this is totally me. And I'm like, I don't, have you read my book? Have you read anything that I put out there? But at least they come in the door. To me, that speaks to the potential effectiveness of it, right? Like, because those same people are not running through the doors of like other anti-racist models.
Yeah.
For example, like that's not happening. So I'm onto something. Not to toot my own horn, but
No. Well, I think the thing that's really nice about it, which I can ask a little bit towards the end of this idea of very, I wouldn't even say positive. I mean, there's obviously positive elements of it, but there's this like very much groundedness and kind of practicality, which is always my pushback when I've heard similar arguments in this space of like, okay, yeah, but we live in a world where this is the case. So like, I can disagree with it or not like it or whatever. And I think a lot of people, but like, and you don't quite just say, well, here's the problem, and well, I guess we'll figure it out one day. It's a little bit more grounded, which is very good. Let me ask one thing here. What about folks like myself, right? So, I'm the day walker, right? So I'm halvesies, right? So right? And I'm not even in the current setup we have in the United States. I'm not even biracial, right? I'm what's the word? I'm multi-ethnic. That's what it is. So my mom's white. She was born here. She's a white woman, and my dad is from Central America, from El Salvador. He immigrated here. Terrible civil war in the 80s. And so he's Latin. I mean, if you go his heritage, there somewhere at some point was Spain. I don't know how many generations ago. And then I think on his dad's side, it was, native indigenous folks in Central America. So he's that mestizo that we have so much of in Latin America. Anyways, the idea is when I go to a doctor's office, or I'm filling out a census form or whatever it is, I always am fortunate, unfortunate. I don't know. I check two boxes, and I check two boxes in two different categories, right? So, right. So the race one, I usually check white, typically, and then the ethnicity category, I check Hispanic, Latin, whatever. It's all the same kind of synonyms for me. But I will say, if there isn't that, there's usually that breakdown. But if there isn't, and it's just all under race, I guess sometimes, I will try to capture though the Latin Hispanic, if that doesn't have like its own category, because I do think that is important. But I remember as I was when I was growing up, I dealt with this. When I was young, I kind of got it early, and I kind of settled, kind of in my early 20s. But as a adolescent and late adolescent and coming into young adulthood, people sometimes would ask me, so which one do you identify with more? Or what are you more like, or whatever? And I usually would say, I wrestled with that, I remember, for a while. I was like, I don't know, what do I feel more of, And then I just kind of resisted the question of sorts, right? Not in an antagonistic way with people, but I would say, I'm equally both. Like, I'm just that's what it is. I mean, that's how it is. If I'm using that framework, yeah, I'm equal parts here in a sense, but I see myself as just both. It's not either or. It's kind of a both and for me. It's just like, yeah, it's part of my story, it's part of my makeup, and that's all it is. And so I'm just very comfortable with that. But it is interesting because and I've talked to other folks that are have a more direct kind of mixture of things. They're biracial or multi-ethnic kind of directly, and we usually have kind of similar ways of getting at it. Like, I can't ever feel when people say we live in a country that's a white supremacist country, or have very negative views about quote unquote white people. It's like, yeah, but that's my own family. Like, and maybe some of my family's terrible, right? But I'm not just going to full stop say a whole thing about a whole quote unquote race of people. And it's the same way with Latin folks or with Black folks. It's like, but yeah, like my other half of the family is this way. Like, I know that those are people in my family that are that way. It's not, I can't other them that way. It's not like, well, I'm this, and not that people ask me to do that or people try to bait me into doing that, but it is interesting when you just see individuals and you see people and you say, hey, like, everybody can be, racist or messed up or whatever, regardless of their quote unquote race or ethnicity, and so it looks a little bit different. But I guess the question here is in your kind of model, your framework, where do you see folks like myself that are all mixed, we're these day walkers walking around, and we're kind of, half this, half that, or whatever. And that is a more common thing for a lot of folks now. Is a lot of the young people are increasingly very diverse. They got parents that are half and half, and then their other parents half and half. And so there are like 5 different things directly. It's not even from generations ago. That's more of a kind of a mixed kind of thing that a lot of young people have now. Where do you kind of see your framework fitting in with folks like myself and others even more kind of mixed than me?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you, too, for sharing a bit about yourself. It's always good to at least feel like I got to know someone that I'm having a conversation with. So I appreciate it. So a couple of things, right? The experience that you shared reflects the significance of the racelessness translation that I was talking about earlier, right? Because if I understand, and this is me having to put myself in the shoes of the folks that you are expressing their views from, right? Like if I had to translate what they were saying, because I've heard it a million times, right? What they're saying isn't about so-called white people. It's about the category of whiteness. Right. And that's part of the barriers aspect that I'm talking about here, that the Wayfinder and the Raceless Antiracist actually helps us to overcome and eliminate that barrier. Right. Because what's actually being communicated there is, again, the problem of racism, which the category of whiteness, like the invention of that very category and the practice of it, because we live in a society where white was deemed superior to all other categories, right? You could not be enslaved and deemed as property or beast or chattel if you were so-called white. Because we live in that model of racism, the category of whiteness comes under fair and heavy critique. As I was saying earlier, it's the category that really should go first if we're being honest, right? But it can't go just by ignoring or pretending that it's not a thing, right? So I would just say that just for anyone listening who that kind of experience resonates with, that part of the translation is what can help all of us better appreciate and understand each other. Right, especially when we're coming from seemingly different experiences or positionalities. That base level understanding, even if we still disagree about what should happen from there, that base level understanding is going to take us a lot further than our current base level of like intentionally misunderstanding. Right, so I would offer you that, right? And in talking about the linguistic shifts that I mentioned earlier, right, part of that translation and part of the language change or shift also then enables us to talk about the problem of racism without people interpreting it or misinterpreting it as something being communicated about the essence of actual human beings, right? Which is, again, obstacle that we constantly get run into in how we currently talk about these problems. In chapter 3 of my book, let me get the exact title because it's a kind of a long one. So chapter 3 is called Human Relation, Embracing Our Rhizomatic Origins. And I co-authored this chapter with Dr. Togetherness Wayfinder, who is a geneticist and a professor at SUNY Downstate in Brooklyn, New York. And I had to bring a scientist in, a hard science person in, to talk about the genetic aspects of all of this. But I suppose I feel like there's no short answer. And whenever I say the short answer, it ends up being a long answer.
It's okay.
So part of what I'm inviting folks to think more deeply about is like, sometimes you hear the cliche, we're all one people, right? We're all one human race, right? You hear those kinds of cliches, which, it's cliche, but it's also accurate. And yet, I feel like because we live in systems where we're still teaching elementary school students, for example, that race is biological, like we're still teaching kids this, we don't actually understand or deep dive into, indeed, the genetic origins and the genetic reality of human beings. You describe yourself as mixed. I would say, and I do make the argument in my first book and in the one that's coming out, that we're all mixed genetically, and when you understand when you understand that humans all originated from what is now called Africa, right? And we lived there for thousands and thousands and thousands of years together, mixing and doing all the things. Maybe scientists don't know exactly how many original Homo sapiens came into existence, but if you're a Christian, then you believe that Adam and Eve were the first people, right? The first Homo sapiens, right? So whether you think we started with 2 or whether you think we started with 100, which is probably more realistic, 100 to 200, something like that. The way that we came to populate the entire earth is by mixing with each other, right? Breeding with each other long enough over a sustained period of time. And then we left the continent, right? We went to different places. They actually found recent evidence, science, that it wasn't just out of Africa once, it was more than once, because people would go back to Africa and go back out, right? Yeah. And so all we have to do to locate our people is go back further than racism trains us to do. Like, we're trained to go back basically to like right before the Middle Passage and be like, those are my people. Wherever those people are, those are my people. So for me as an African American, it's like, okay, 500 years ago, my people are in Benin, in Africa, right? Like, that's how I decide my people. But and maybe your people, I think you said on your mom's side, 500 years ago, maybe her people are somewhere in Europe, right? Probably Western Europe. And so those are her people. But all she has to do is just go far enough back until she finds her people in Africa. Right? And every single one of us, all of our people, we all go back to Africa. We all have all the same ancestors, and we all originate from all of the same human beings. It's just that my great times 50 aunt is your great times 40 cousin. You know, they're just on different places on the family tree, but all of the same humans like made all of us. Right? But we just don't it's like we have very little acceptance or appreciation or understanding of what it means for us to be a single species and what it means for us to have all originated from the same humans on the continent of Africa. And so my invitation to everyone listening, right, is to like think really deeply about our human origins and do your own research, of course, to find all this evidence. I'll also say that scientists have for a long time proven that there's more genetic diversity on the continent of Africa, largely because humans originated there. So we've been there the longest. So we've been mixing there the longest, right? There's more genetic diversity between like a Kenyan and a Ghanaian when compared with a Kenyan to an Irish person or any other place, or a Mongolian or whatever, right? Like, there's more genetic diversity just on the continent of Africa alone between people who are, to American minds, all black, right? Because we translate African into black. And I saw recent studies coming out in, like, I want to say late 2023, that showed that there is significant admixture among European populations that people presumed wasn't the case because they're Europeans. And it's like, of course that's true, because all you have to know is basic human history, right? To like, I mean, it is basic human history. Again, what I'm saying is it's really not rocket science. So we're all mixed. And the fact that we trick ourselves into thinking that any of us can fit into 1 or 2 boxes or 3 or 4 or 5 boxes of a fiction, of a unicorn in the first place, to me is just so farcical and nonsensical. And a lot of people who are racialized in the US as mixed, as biracial, or multiracial, right? A lot of people who get racialized in that way have over time been some of the primary voices against the problem of racism because of the limitations of the category. And many African American writers, for instance, who also are often human rights activists during their lifetimes, they also will use the character of the mulatto or the octoroon in their literature to help their readers, who are primarily women who get racialized as white, to better grapple with the problem of reality. And in some ways, ostensibly, it was easier or better strategy to do that through a person who looks white, but on a blood level is perceived as black, right? So they would do that through fiction. And so it's unsurprising to me to hear your experiences and your perspective on it, because it's all a unicorn in the first place. And it also demonstrates I don't know, like the nefarious ways that people, again, unintentionally maintain the problem of white supremacy, often when trying to speak against this thing called white supremacy and the practice of it, right? So yeah, in my first book, I dedicate an entire chapter to what I call walking negatives, where I use 3 mulatto characters from 3 different books from 3 different time periods to really examine how the writer's inclusion and I guess representation of those characters in the world of the novels reflect the reality and reflect the real fiction of race, right? And the real problem of racism and the need to undo racism. We have to undo race. I use those characters in those instances to demonstrate that. But other people, like sociologists, Carrie Ann Rockamore, she has a book called, I think it's called Beyond Black or something. Something like that. I want to say late 90s or early 2000s. She did a study with however many hundreds of people who Americans identified as like biracial or multiracial. And she ends up concluding that that the majority of the people she interviewed saw themselves as, in some way, shape, or form, transcending the category of race. Some identified as black, some identified as white, some identified as both, some identified as biracial, and some just refused to identify at all. And so for folks who get racialized in those seemingly more like complex ways, sometimes it can be the fiction of it all, right? And the kind of like fool's errand of it all can be just more obvious because of their lived experiences. But I'm trying to bring to the fore that it's all stupid is such a harsh word. It's all foolish, like all of it. But it's foolish with consequences, right? And that's the problem. Oh, and I will say too, I do not check any of the boxes. So I get this question sometimes like, well, what do you do if you got to check a box, right? So I don't check the boxes. And I remember when we first moved to Oneonta from DC, I had to set appointments and such with a new pediatrician, and that comes with paperwork. And I'll always remember the receptionist on the phone was like, okay, and what race is your child? And I was like, check decline or check other, like what options do you have besides just choosing a race, right? And she's like, oh, we don't have, like, basically there wasn't another an out option. And I said, well, no, I declined to answer that. And so you're going to find a way to like bypass that question in the system because, and she's like, well, but they need this for lab work and stuff. I said, that's a lie. That's not true. And you're talking to the person who happens to know this for a fact. So you can go ahead and not check any of those boxes. And bless her heart, she did not. None of my doctors have checked it behind our backs when we're not looking. I look in the system periodically to see if anyone was like tempted to check a box, and they haven't. And since my kids started kindergarten this year, I went through the same rigmarole where they wouldn't give me an out. And the assistant superintendent calls me and says, because I said, well, since you won't give me an out, I'm checking all the boxes. I kid you not, Xavier. I checked all the boxes. I sent the paperwork in. I send the paperwork in. The assistant superintendent calls me. She's like, oh, wait. She calls me after I get confirmation of their registration into the school.
Mm-hmm.
And I see on their confirmation that somebody checked Black.
Mm-hmm.
I said, I know I didn't check this, right? At the time, I couldn't remember that I had checked all the boxes, but I said, I know I didn't check that. So I emailed somebody. I said, I want that removed. Go ahead and pick other or decline or whatever the other options are, right? So the assistant superintendent calls me and she says, this is how we get, and I'm quoting her, this is how we get our money, this race box.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I can't give you an out for the other some of the other questions have outs and like other options, but this is how we get our money for this race box. So I was like, I know that's the problem, right? because most districts who have more racialized white students, even in poorer districts, get more dollars than non-white, right?
Right.
So I was like, go ahead and check all the boxes then, because she's telling me there's no out. I said, go ahead and check all the boxes. She's like, but we need to like narrow it down to one or two. I said that's incorrect. If you can check two, then you can easily just go ahead and check the remaining three. Like just go ahead and check all the boxes. She said, where can I look for more information? Do other districts have other options or something? I mean, because in her talking to me, it was clear that she thinks that race is biological, right? Mm-hmm. So she's like, I'm not talking about gender. I was like, I know you're not talking about gender. She's like, I'm talking about race. I was like, I know. I wrote a book, lady. Like, you should read it. So they never called me back. She said she was going to do research and call me back, and she never called me back, or she hasn't yet. Bless her heart if she does. Mm-hmm. But like, I'm sure they immediately Googled my name and were like, oh, this is not the right person to have this conversation with.
Yeah.
But also nobody had questioned it before. She, at least according to her knowledge of the history of the school and stuff, like nobody had questioned that category before. And so I would like to see more questioning of it, right? Whether it's the census, I mean, the medical side of this is such a farce. It's not even funny. And the money that the super elites have because of the fiction of race and the problem of racism is like outrageous. And we should be demanding change. And never mind politics. Like, I'm sure you're paying attention to what's happening right now. And, something significant is happening in November. And the tactics that the politicians use, right, along the lines of race and racism, I'm just like, am I the only one who's like, who just wants more, who just wants better? Like, we're happy with this. Are we really happy with this? I'm not. So this is an invitation to anyone and all listening who are dissatisfied and who actually are about the life of solutions, right? Because, as you said, plenty of people talk about problems, but not everyone seems to have a solution in mind or a solution to offer, right? And I'm sick of people, this is me complaining now, I'm sick of people just complaining about problems, pointing them out over and over and over and over and over and over and over, and seemingly satisfied with that. Like, that's enough. Like, we need to know again that this thing is happening, right? Like, when are we going to get past that point to actually solving the problems? That's what I want to know, Xavier.
I mean, listen, I'm with you. I'm totally with you on that. I mean, I agree. There's a lot of pointing about things, and then it's like, well, what do we do about it? And I always feel very empty when I read stuff like that. I want to ask two final questions here. One's a big one, but you can go as long as you want on it. But your book is the Raceless Antiracist. Now, that might be an interesting term for some people because they will know from Mr. Ibram X. Kendi as what is it? How to Be an Antiracist? I think was that the title of the book. And he was a pretty large popular figure over, I'd say 4 or 5 years ago during 2020 and all these things. And even before that and a little after that, of course, you had Ta-Nehisi Coates, who was prior to him, and he also would talk about race in particular ways. But this anti-racist framework that the way he espoused it became, kind of like wildfire for a little bit, at least in academia, a little bit in the corporate world, a little bit in a lot of places. And, there's definitely it's had a cooling period for, I would say now, more recently, in the past year and a half. But, he had a pretty, I would say, kind of a black and white way of seeing this. You're either a racist or you're an anti-racist, and that was just not, you can't be a non-racist, right? You have to be an anti-racist or you're a racist. And it was it's either this or this, right? It's absolute. And then you had a lot of other characters involved as well, talking about, do you have internalized white supremacy, or we have white supremacy, or white people are somehow all inherently racist and all these things. There was all of this kinds of talk. And you had various white allies that were kind of doing some interesting things about trying to, atone for their sins of whiteness and all this other kinds of stuff. I guess you can tell me any of your thoughts on any of that, any things you like, criticisms you have. But then I guess, what is your kind of approach? And this is kind of towards the last question of the pragmatic. So you can split them all, or you can put them all together if you want. But of how you see it, of how, like, yeah, we've had some different alternatives. We've had people that have said, maybe we do it this way. Maybe we try it this way, or what's your bias, or what's your how are you being an anti-racist? And I mean, there's been a proliferation of so many books and everything on it, and people are really just kind of instantly, almost seemingly, just inhaled it. They were just like, yeah, that's what we're doing, and okay. But I guess you have an alternative, and so maybe you can share kind of the pragmatics of, how do we end racism as you talk about it, and what are some practical ways in which we do that? You have an appendix at the end of the book, which is really nice, which is very practical. So yeah, tell us about Kendi, anti-racism, that whole thing, and how those things moved along, and your likes, dislikes, or what you disagree with or what you agree with, and then what your alternative is.
Sure. So I talk specifically about Kendi's approach and some alignment and some potential differences or distinctions in some parts of my book, very briefly.
Yeah.
But I like to move the starting point of anti-racism long before Kendi, because first, he didn't coin the word. And he definitely didn't invent anti-racism as a practice or as a way of living and being and all of that. So while I can appreciate the fact that for many people, this was like a new, seemingly radical happening, a radical figure with a radical text, to my mind, I think it's actually more important to recognize how anti-racism, as people tend to think of it, right? Like, as people who are actively working against racism, goes back to the days of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacob, right? Like, part of the arc that I'm showing folks is that all the way back to the period of abolitionism during chattel slavery required Frederick Douglass, required Harriet Jacobs to both inherit their so-called blackness, required all others, Thomas Jefferson, right? Like, all of the founding fathers, all of the people who lived during that time period, to inherit their whiteness, to inherit the categories that were designated to them and argued to be natural, while also, for many of them, striving to be anti-racist and in particular, to end the system of chattel slavery. And that meant that you have Frederick Douglass saying, I'm what's ostensibly today understood as like, I'm black and I'm human, right? You have Sojourner Truth saying, I'm a woman and I'm Black, right? You have Harriet Jacobs saying, I'm Black and I'm a human, and trying to help other people who get racialized as white, meaning seen as human, humanized, right? To recognize they're also shared humanity and to fight against the system of chattel enslavement. And obviously with success, because fortunately, I mean, it took a civil war and all that, but fortunately, chattel slavery is not on the ground in American society anymore, right? Then you fast forward to the period of Reconstruction, then to the Harlem Renaissance, then to the formal civil rights movement, then to the Black Lives Matter movement. Through all of these time periods, consistently and all in between, you have people making the type of declaration to say, I am Black and I'm human. I am colored and I'm human. I'm African American and I'm human. And the reason why a person has to make that assertion in the first place is because the category of what we now call Blackness, for the most part, that category was designated as subhuman, if human at all, from the outset of the invention of this thing called race in the first place. And so to fight racism, you have people inheriting that component of racism itself and having to use it in their strategy for anti-racism. And part of my critique of Kendi and all and any who came before and in between is you cannot make an assertion such as I am Black and I'm human, because on its face it's an oxymoron. It's contradictory, right? The very category of Blackness itself as race was designated as the dehumanized status. And we cannot reform or reconstruct race in a way that makes it so that that is not the case, because that's the very design of race in the first place. And whether you're Kendi or, again, anyone else, if and sincerely and in good faith wanting to fight against racism, hopefully with the express purpose of ending it, right? You cannot be contradictory in that manner, because the obstacles that you would recognize and want others to acknowledge, like the obstacles that D'Angelo puts forth in White Fragility and Nice Racism and stuff, and that Kendi puts forth in How to Be an Anti-Racist, those obstacles will always be maintained because of the way that racism through the categories of race actually works. And so come on over to the Togetherness Wayfinder, where you get the language, you get the concepts, you get the philosophies of race, you get the rules, and you get the tools to actually effectively help people on an individual and collective level stop the causes and effects of racism. And the last thing I'll say is, right, like, in terms of practicality and such, and also in terms of translations, I guess a couple of things. Like, when D'Angelo talks about how, quote unquote, all people are racist, I think a better way to say potentially the same thing, so I'm laughing at myself here, but like how I talk about it in the book is, if you are raised in a society, if you live in a society where you get racialized as white, you are being socialized to be racist. And that's a fact. That's like how it works. If you are taught race ideology and you are taught to racialize human beings, you're part of the machinery of racism. And too often, I see people being concerned over being called racist or identified as racist, and less concerned about actually being racist or actually maintaining or upholding the problem of racism. And to me, that goes back to one of the barriers I referenced a couple of times earlier in our conversation. The barrier of a person not wanting to be called racist, but being comfortable being racist, that's a significant barrier. Right. And not every person is going to have an awakening just because they engage with my work in the Togetherness Wayfinder. That's true. But more people certainly will than if we use the framing and the frames that you've referenced and that I've referenced. Because again, those frames are starting from the place of dehumanization of some people and the presumed humanization of other people. So we're starting from a point of deficit as opposed to starting from a point of, I don't know, equal, like an equal playing field, if you will. I don't know. That might be a good metaphor. I'm not sure. We need to start from an equal playing field so that we can all be more clear-eyed about the problems, and through the proper language, through the proper rules, through the proper tools and the philosophies of race, we can actually do that work together. We can all reap benefits from doing that work together. And at the same time, we don't have to wait for those people over there to stop being racist or to care about racism in order to actually work to solve the causes and effects of racism. And I think the last question you asked in terms of
the pragmatics.
Yeah, so I mentioned the tools, the rules. I mean, pragmatically, you need to read the book because nothing I could say in a short conversation can really demonstrate the complexity and the richness of what I offer in the book. I talk about genetics. I talk about culture. I talk about ethnicity. I talk about social and economic class and the need to separate those two things instead of doing the whole like socioeconomic thing. I talk about racism, and I talk about our conception of and practice of deciding like who's human and who's not human and how and all these different things. I talk about all of that, and I synthesize a lot of information in a short amount of time. I offer a glossary of terms. I offer further resources and readings list at the end. I offer a 45-day guide as an appendix, to where if you are committed to engaging as deeply as you can with some of the ideas that I'm offering, then you can do different activities and things to help further your learning, even after you're done reading the book. So practically speaking, people need to read the book. Otherwise, you'll be assuming I'm saying things, and I think it's good for people to learn like what I'm actually communicating, right? Yeah, especially before they decide if they agree or disagree.
I totally agree with you. And one of the nice things about the book is that it's very detailed. It's well researched. There's actually really, really good historical pieces. You're bringing other cultural pieces in there. So it's very, very good in that way. Sheena, I know you're super busy with all the personal and professional things, so I really am grateful for how much time you've given me. You're very generous, and I really appreciate your wisdom, your brightness, your positive outlook, and all the research and work you've done, and for coming and sharing it here. I really enjoyed the conversation, and it always pushes me to think about things, hopefully for listeners as well. So I'm very much grateful for you coming and sharing your work with us.
Thanks, Xavier. That's actually the highest compliment you can give me, that I've inspired you to think more about things. Like that's it. That's what I'm really asking people to do, right? Like just think more about it, and think,
of course,
and consider this while you're thinking.
Yes. That's for sure.